The blood on her scrubs wasn't hers. Evelyn Hayes stood in the middle of the emergency corridor, 12 armed soldiers flooding in behind her, rifles sweeping every doorway. The overhead lights flickered. A monitor screamed flatline somewhere down the hall, and the doctors who had signed her termination papers 40 minutes ago, the ones who'd called her incompetent, unstable, a liability, stood frozen against the wall, staring at her like they were seeing a ghost wearing a dead woman's face. One of the soldiers stepped forward. He didn't ask for identification. He didn't check a badge. He looked at her, then snapped to attention and saluted. Every other rifle in the corridor lowered at once. The chief of medicine's mouth opened, but nothing came out, because the woman they'd just thrown out of their hospital, the nurse they'd mocked, blamed, and dismissed, had just walked back in with the United States Army. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor. Follow along until the very end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. Redstone Regional Medical Center sat at the edge of Ashcroft, Colorado, wedged between a stretch of empty highway and the kind of mountain landscape that looked peaceful until the winter hit and made everything brutal. The hospital was mid-sized, underfunded in the places that mattered, overfunded in the lobby renovation that had happened twice in 4 years. It had new floors, bad staffing ratios, and an administration that cared deeply about quarterly metrics and almost nothing about the people producing them. Evelyn Hayes had worked there for 2 years. She wasn't the kind of nurse people noticed right away. 30 years old, medium height, brown hair she kept pulled back so tight it looked almost severe. She didn't make small talk in the break room. She didn't go to the after-shift drinks. She showed up early, stayed late, charted accurately, and never once called in sick. Her patient satisfaction scores were consistently in the top 15% of the floor. Nobody mentioned that part much. What they mentioned was the way she sometimes moved through a crisis. Too calm, people said. Unsettling, the way she didn't flinch. One of the ER attendings, Dr. Marcus Holt, had made a comment once about how she looked like she was waiting for something worse to happen. He'd said it like it was a character flaw. Evelyn had simply checked the patient's pressure cuff and not responded. That was 3 months ago. Things had gotten worse since then. The patient in Bay 7 was named Gerald Pruitt, 62, brought in that morning with chest pain and a BP reading that had no business being stable. Evelyn had flagged him twice during the shift, charted her concerns, documented the irregularities in his rhythm, and paged the attending physician, Dr. Holt, at 9:14 and again at 9:47. Holt hadn't come. He'd sent a resident instead, a second-year named Kira Osman, who was still learning to read a 12 lead with confidence. Kira had looked at the chart, looked at Evelyn, and said, "Dr. Holt says you're overcautious. He says to continue monitoring." Evelyn had looked at the screen. She'd looked at Pruitt's color, that particular gray-yellow shade that meant something was already wrong underneath the numbers. She'd said, "Tell him I'm formally requesting a senior review. I want that documented." Kira had gone pale, nodded, and disappeared. By 10:15, Gerald Pruitt had coded. He survived, barely, because Evelyn had been standing in that room when it happened and had the crash cart accessed before the alarm had finished its first full cycle. She'd run the code, called compressions, pushed the epi, and had him back in under 4 minutes. By 10:45, Dr. Holt had walked into the bay and looked at her like she'd caused the whole thing. "You upset him," Holt said. He was a tall man, late 40s, the kind of lean that came from the gym rather than from worry. He had a face that defaulted to mild condescension the way other people defaulted to neutral. "You've been in here every 20 minutes. Patients feel that anxiety. They internalize it." Evelyn stood at the foot of the bed. He had a Widowmaker presentation. The ST elevation was, "I read the strip." Holt cut her off. "I've been reading EKGs since you were in middle school." "Then you saw it." A pause. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite. More like irritation that she'd said it out loud. "What I see," he said slowly, "is a nurse who second-guessed the attending twice, created unnecessary escalation, and now wants credit for a code that happened in part because the patient was overstimulated. The resident was still in the doorway. Two other nurses had drifted close enough to hear. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. The code happened because the presentation was missed. I documented it. It's in the chart, which I will be reviewing. His voice had gone flat. Along with your conduct. She held his gaze for one more second, then looked back at the patient monitor. Gerald Pruitt's rhythm had steadied. His wife was on her way. He was going to live. That was the part Holt wasn't going to put in his report. The meeting happened at 1:30 that afternoon, in a conference room on the second floor that smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner. Evelyn sat across from Holt and the nursing director, a woman named Deborah Stiles, who had the careful energy of someone who had learned to survive administration by never picking a side loudly. There was also a representative from HR whose name Evelyn didn't bother to remember. Holt had a folder. Of course, he had a folder. This isn't the first time, he said, opening it. February, you overrode a discharge order and kept a patient 4 hours past his scheduled release. He presented with post-op fever and altered mentation. He was readmitted 2 days later with sepsis. Holt looked up. That's not the point. I'd argue it is. Deborah Stiles touched the table lightly with 2 fingers. Evelyn, let's try to... And March, Holt continued, you had a conflict with Dr. Reyes about medication sequencing on a post-surgical patient. The sequence he ordered would have bottomed out her BP. I flagged it. You flagged it loudly, in front of the patient. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She asked me directly if something was wrong. I don't lie to patients. Holt closed the folder. He had the look of a man who'd already decided the outcome and was just performing the procedural steps before arriving at it. We have a culture here, a collaborative environment, and what you demonstrate repeatedly is an inability to function within a team without creating friction. Or, Evelyn said, what I demonstrate is an ability to catch things before they become disasters. The chart will show that every time I flagged something, I was right. Charts don't show attitude, he said. There it was. That was the real sentence, the one under all the procedural language. Charts don't show attitude. As if being right while someone else was wrong was the actual offense. Deborah leaned forward. Evelyn, we think it might be beneficial to put you on a performance improvement plan. 60 days with, I won't sign a PIP. Silence. Excuse me, Deborah said. There's no performance problem in my record that isn't actually a documentation of me being correct. I won't sign something that implies otherwise. Holt leaned back. The slight smile on his face was the worst part. Then we have a problem. You have a problem, Evelyn said. I did my job. The HR representative said quietly, if you refuse to cooperate with the PIP process, we'd be looking at a suspension pending review, or what? Evelyn asked. Nobody answered immediately. Termination, Holt said. Like it tasted fine. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag from the floor beside her chair. You've got a patient on 7 who I flagged 2 weeks ago for cognitive decline that his primary keeps attributing to anxiety, she said. His name is Pruitt, different from the one this morning, coincidence, room 714. His labs from yesterday show a pattern I've documented. Someone should actually look at it. She stood. You're running out of time on that one. Holt didn't write it down. She walked out. The parking lot was cold. Ashcroft in late October had that particular bitterness that came before the real snow, the kind of cold that felt personal. Evelyn sat in her car for 4 minutes before she started it. She wasn't crying, she was thinking, which looked similar from the outside and felt completely different on the inside. 2 years. She'd kept her head down, done the work, stayed inside the lines. And it hadn't mattered. Not to Holt, not to Stiles, not to any of the administration that smiled during recognition events and then made decisions in conference rooms that the people doing the actual work never heard about until it was done. She'd known institutions like this before, just different kinds. She put the car in reverse. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Military exchange prefix, the kind she recognized by pattern rather than by stored contact. Her hand paused on the gear shift. She picked up. Hayes? Static. Then a voice. Male. Clipped. We're trying to locate former Sergeant Hayes, Army MOS 68W, attached to the 10th Special Forces Group. Honorable discharge 18 months ago. She was very still. You've located her. Ma'am, we have a situation developing in your area. Do you have a current position? I just left work. A pause. Why? The voice said something to someone else, too low to catch. Then, stay near the hospital if you're able, ma'am. We may need you on the ground. She looked in her rearview mirror at the emergency bay entrance. The sliding doors, the fluorescent glow of the trauma ward she'd just been fired from. What kind of situation? Another pause, longer this time. Priority medical and security. That's all I'm authorized to say right now. She sat with that for a moment, then, I'll be in the parking lot. She ended the call. Put the car back in park. Outside, the clouds over the mountains had gone a dark, flat gray. The kind of sky that came before something bad happened. Or maybe that was just the pattern her brain had learned. Years of reading environments, reading sky, reading the space between calm and not calm for the shift that meant you needed to move. She rolled her window down an inch. Cold air, the distant sound of an ambulance somewhere down the highway. 11 minutes later, she heard helicopters. They weren't civilian medevac birds. The sound was different, lower, heavier, the rotor beat of military transports running hard and low. 2 of them, coming in from the northwest, and Evelyn was out of her car before they'd fully come into view. The first chopper overshot the hospital's landing pad and came around for a second approach. The second one held altitude, circling. Even from the parking lot, she could see the door gunner. That wasn't standard. Her phone rang again. Same number. Ma'am, are you still at the hospital? I'm in the lot. What's coming in? Priority military casualty. Classified asset. He was ambushed 40 minutes ago on Route 7. He's lost significant blood, and he's got hardware in him that our field team couldn't fully stabilize. A short pause. The pilot called Redstone because it was the closest level 2. We didn't know you were... Another voice in the background. Ma'am, we need you inside. Now. Our team is 30 seconds out. She was already moving. The sliding doors opened, and she walked back into the hospital she'd been fired from 45 minutes ago without slowing down. The ER desk nurse, Paula, who'd worked nights with Evelyn for 18 months, looked up and went confused immediately. Evelyn? You're not... What trauma bays are open? 1 and 3, but I need one prepped for a gunshot. Military. Multiple wounds. Probable vascular compromise. Do you have O negative in the warmer? Paula blinked. Yes, but you can't. The ambulance bay doors blew open. 2 men in tactical gear came through first, rifles up, sweeping. Behind them, a stretcher moving fast, a third soldier maintaining pressure on a wound pack at the patient's left side, while a fourth held a bag of saline. The patient was in full kit, face gray-white, breathing shallow and fast. Evelyn was already gloved. She'd grabbed from the supply cart without breaking stride. She knew where everything was. She'd worked this ER for 2 years. She could find the gloves blind. Bay 1, she said to the team. The soldiers looked at each other for half a second. One of them, the one maintaining pressure, dark-eyed, dirt on his face, sergeant's tabs visible under the plate carrier, looked at her directly. Who are you? Trauma nurse. Former 68W. Move. He moved. Behind them, Dr. Holt appeared at the bay entrance. He'd heard the commotion and come down from wherever he'd retreated after the meeting, and he stood there processing the scene with the particular expression of a man who understood he'd lost control of a situation but hadn't caught up to the implications yet. What's happening? He looked at Evelyn. Why are you still here? You were... Breathing's compromised, Evelyn said to the room, not looking at him. She had her hands on the patient now, one on the wound site, her eyes reading his chest rise, the color of his nail beds, the quality of the vein in his neck. He's got a tension pneumo developing on the left. I need a chest decompression kit. I need type and cross on the blood from the IV already in his arm. And I need someone to call your trauma surgeon because this man is going to need the OR in the next 12 minutes. Nobody moved. Evelyn looked up. Paula was there, eyes wide. The two ER nurses behind her were frozen. Holt was in the doorway with his arms crossed like he was considering whether to intervene on procedural grounds. One of the soldiers, the one who hadn't asked her name, who'd been quiet at the back of the group since they'd entered, said from the doorway, "Do what she says." Something in his voice moved everyone. Paula went for the kit. The two nurses broke toward the supply drawers. Holt opened his mouth. "Doctor," the soldier said, looking at him with an expression that was flat and final. "Stand aside." Holt stood aside. Evelyn worked. It wasn't graceful. Her hands weren't perfectly steady. They never were. The small tremor in her right index finger had been there since a vehicle rollover in a place she didn't talk about, and it didn't affect her work, but it was there. She talked out loud, not for the staff's benefit, but because that was how she thought under pressure. Narrating, tracking, keeping the thread. "Pressure's dropping. He needs at least 2 units on board before we even look at the chest. Paula, tell me his O2 sat." 81. "That's the pneumo. Kit." Paula handed it. Evelyn didn't hesitate. The soldier on the left side of the bay looked away. The one in the doorway didn't. When the needle went in and the air released, that hiss, that specific sound that meant the lung had room to expand again, the patient's color changed within 30 seconds. Not dramatically, not like the movies, just slightly less dead. "Set coming up," Paula said. 88, 90. "Good." Evelyn pulled back, assessed. "Where's my surgeon?" "Dr. Villanueva is on his way up," one of the nurses said. "Good. He needs a trauma lap when he gets here. I want ultrasound on the abdomen before he's in the room, and someone get vascular on the phone because that exit wound on his thigh hit something it shouldn't have." She looked at the blood pressure reading. "He's going to arrest again if his pressure drops below 80. Keep me posted every 90 seconds. She stepped back, stripped one glove, looked at the patient's face for the first time as a whole rather than as a collection of problems to solve. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe mid-30s. There was a tattoo on his left forearm she couldn't fully see under the bandaging, but the partial image, unit crest, she thought, though she couldn't place it from this angle, was familiar in a way that made her chest tighten slightly. She looked up at the soldier in the doorway. "What's his name?" A pause. "Calloway. Major Daniel Calloway." She looked back at the patient. "Who's after him?" Another pause, longer. "That's the problem," the soldier said. "We don't know how many, and we don't know if they followed the bird." The words sat in the room for a moment. Paula said very quietly, "Followed the bird where?" Nobody answered, because the answer was obvious, and saying it out loud in a hospital emergency bay with patients in the surrounding rooms and staff who hadn't signed up for this was the kind of thing that turned a bad situation into a panicked one. Evelyn looked at the soldier. "You need to lock this building down. All entries. Put your people on the ambulance bay and the stairwells. The service entrance on the north side has a keycard reader that fails in cold weather. Someone needs to be there physically." He stared at her. "I know the building," she said. "I've worked here for 2 years. Do you want to argue about it, or do you want to secure the perimeter?" He pulled out his radio. Down the hall, somewhere past the double doors to the main corridor, something banged. Hard. The kind of sound that in most contexts could be a supply cart, a dropped tray, an accident. But the two soldiers in the bay had their rifles up before the echo finished, and Evelyn Hayes, who had spent 2 years trying very hard to be just a nurse, felt something shift in the back of her mind, some old dormant switch clicking into a position it hadn't occupied in 18 months. She reached past Paula and picked up the trauma shears from the supply cart. Old habits. The bang came again, closer. The third bang was different from the first two. The first had been sharp, something striking metal, the kind of sound that could still be explained away. The second had been closer, with a different resonance, something hollow beneath it. The third had a weight to it, a deliberateness, and every soldier in the bay heard the difference without anyone saying so out loud. The sergeant in the doorway, Evelyn had started thinking of him as the one in charge, because he was the one giving the quiet nods that made other people move, pressed his radio to his ear and listened for 3 seconds. Then he said, "We've got a breach on the north corridor, 2 tangos, possibly 3. They came through the service entrance." Evelyn said, "I told you about that door." He didn't respond to that. "We've got 4 of our people inside and 6 more coming from the second bird. ETA 4 minutes. He looked at her. "Can your patient survive 4 minutes without you?" She looked at Calloway. His sats were holding at 94. The bleeding had slowed with the compression packing. His pressure was still low, but not in freefall. "Doctor." Villanueva wasn't in the room yet. She could hear him coming down the hall, his voice preceding him, talking to someone about the ultrasound. And the 2 nurses had a handle on the monitoring. "If Villanueva gets in here in the next 60 seconds, yes," she said. As if on cue, Villanueva pushed through the bay curtain. Mid-50s, built like someone who'd played football in another life. Reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He took in the scene in about 2 seconds. Military patient, tactical team, Evelyn Hayes, who was supposed to have been escorted off the premises today. "What?" he started. "Tension pneumo decompressed, SATs 94, pressure's running 70/40. He's going to need your OR," Evelyn said. 2 units of O negative in, type, and cross-sent, ultrasound's on its way. He's got vascular involvement in the right thigh." Villanueva stared at her, then at the patient. Then he snapped into work mode like a machine turning over. Okay, let's get him moving." He looked at Paula. "Or 2, call them now." Evelyn stepped back, stripped the second glove. The sergeant was already at her elbow. "Ma'am, North Corridor." She knew the North Corridor. She'd walked it twice a day for 2 years. Knew where the supply rooms were, which rooms had locking doors, and which ones had the cheap knob hardware that a hard shoulder would defeat. Knew that the corridor kinked left at the junction near radiology, which meant anyone coming from the service entrance would have a blind spot for approximately 4 feet before they hit the main intersection. She also knew there were 3 patient rooms along that stretch, 2 of them occupied. "How many of your people are between here and there?" she asked, already moving. "One stationed at the main junction. He's holding position." "And the patients in 108 and 110? The sergeant faltered for just a half step. They're civilian patients. 108 has a post-surgical hip replacement, 70 years old, not mobile. 110 is a respiratory case, on supplemental oxygen." She looked at him. "If your tangos get to that junction and your guy doesn't hold, those 2 rooms are directly in the line." He was on the radio before she finished the sentence. They moved into the main corridor together, which was already in a state of controlled deterioration. The overhead PAs were silent. Someone had been smart enough not to trigger the full alarm, which would have sent everyone flooding into the corridors at once. But word had spread the way it always did in hospitals, through some invisible network of overheard radio traffic and staff body language. Nurses were steering patients back into rooms. An orderly stood flat against the wall near the elevator bank, eyes wide, not sure what he was supposed to do. "Stay in that room and don't open the door for anyone who doesn't knock 3 times, Evelyn told him. He nodded and disappeared. At the far end of the corridor, she heard voices. 2 of them, clipped and professional in a way that sounded practiced, not panicked, not hospital voices. And underneath the voices, a sound she recognized from a context she rarely thought about, the specific metallic sound of a weapon being charged. The sergeant's hand came to her shoulder. She stopped. They were at the edge of the kink in the corridor. 12 feet ahead, the junction. She could see the corner of the wall, the industrial light fixture, the edge of the door to room 108 with the yellow nameplate she'd read so many times it was memorized. One of the soldiers pressed himself against the wall on the opposite side. He held up 3 fingers, then 2, then pointed around the corner. 2 of them. At the junction. Between here and the OR elevator where Villanueva was trying to move Calloway. Evelyn did a quiet calculation. The OR elevator was on the other side of the junction. If they moved Calloway now, they'd be rolling him directly into the line of fire. If they waited, his pressure would keep dropping. Villanueva was good, but he couldn't perform surgery in a trauma bay. She looked at the sergeant. "Is there another route to OR2? He shook his head. "We don't know the layout." "I do." She thought for 3 seconds. Service hallway behind radiology. It adds 4 minutes to the transport, but it goes around the North Corridor entirely. You need to get Villanueva on that route. He relayed it into the radio in a low voice. Then he looked at her. And these two? You've got one person at the junction? Corporal Reyes, yes. Tell him to hold, don't engage yet. She was looking at the wall, at the layout in her head. She knew what was 2 rooms to the left, the radiology supply closet, which backed up against the North Corridor. She'd requisitioned supplies from it 40 times. She knew what the door sounded like when it opened, which direction it swung, what was on the other side of the shared wall. There's a closet access that opens on their side, she said quietly. If your corporal engages from the front while someone comes through that door from the flank, you split their attention. The sergeant looked at her for a moment, not skeptically, more like he was recalibrating something. You'd need someone who knows which door and how fast to move. She held his gaze. Former 68W, he said slowly, isn't infantry. No, she agreed. But it's not nothing either. He was quiet for 2 seconds. In a firefight, 2 seconds was a long time to think. Stay behind the threshold. You open the door, you get back. My people move through. Understood. It wasn't perfectly coordinated. She'd worked with special forces teams overseas that could execute a flanking maneuver with the precision of a machine, and this wasn't that. 2 of his people were with Calloway. One was holding the junction, and the remaining soldier with them was a staff sergeant named Briggs, who'd been quiet the whole time and had the look of someone who ran on adrenaline and muscle memory. But they moved. The radiology closet door was locked. Of course it was. Evelyn pulled her badge, her now technically invalid badge, the one they hadn't thought to deactivate yet, and held it to the reader. The light turned green. She pushed the door open 8 inches, stepped back against the wall exactly as the sergeant had told her, and Briggs went through low and fast. She heard the commotion before she understood its shape. A shout, a scuffle, 2 controlled bursts of sound that weren't gunfire, but were close enough that her body reacted before her brain finished processing. Then Corporal Reyes from the front, and a crash, and then 30 seconds of nothing that felt much longer. Clear, Briggs said. She came around the corner, 2 men on the ground. Zip-tied, not dead, Briggs was efficient, and they'd clearly wanted them alive. Both were dressed in civilian clothes that were too deliberate, too coordinated in the way of people trying to look random. One had a split lip from the takedown. The other was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone doing math on how badly they'd miscalculated. Corporal Reyes, young, maybe 24, dust on his jacket and a cut above his eyebrow, looked at Evelyn and then at the sergeant. Who is she? She used to do this in combat, the sergeant said. He said it simply. Not as a compliment, exactly. More as a fact that explained something. But Evelyn heard it anyway, the words landing differently than she expected. Somewhere in the chest where she'd spent 18 months convincing herself that part of her life was put away for good. The rest of the next 20 minutes was ugly in the way that real situations were ugly. Fragmented, loud in wrong places, and too quiet in others, with decisions made on incomplete information and no clean version of anything. A third attacker was found in the stairwell near the 2nd floor by the soldiers from the 2nd helicopter who'd arrived and swept the building with a thoroughness that the hospital's security team, 2 guards, both of whom had taken shelter behind the main desk, watched with expressions somewhere between relief and wounded pride. Dr. Holt appeared twice. First in the main corridor, where he demanded to know who had authorized a military operation in his hospital, a question that nobody answered because nobody felt it warranted one. Second, outside the trauma bay, where he'd apparently tried to re-enter while Villanueva was moving Calloway through the service route and been stopped by a soldier who looked through him like he was a moderately interesting piece of furniture. Evelyn heard about the second incident from Paula, who reported it with a composure that barely concealed satisfaction. The administrative wing had gone into a lockdown of a different kind, the kind where executives gathered in one room and made calls to lawyers and PR firms while the actual crisis was happening 4 floors away. Evelyn had no direct evidence of this, but she'd worked in enough institutions to know the pattern. Major Calloway made it to OR2. Villanueva's report relayed through Briggs, was cautious but not catastrophic. The vascular damage was significant but repairable. The abdominal scan had come back clean, and barring complications, he had reasonable odds. Reasonable odds? In Evelyn's experience, that was as good as it got. She was in the break room on the second floor, hands around a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk, when the sergeant found her. She'd learned his name by then, Captain Darius Thorne, 75th Ranger Regiment, currently attached to a task force she wasn't cleared to know the name of and probably never would be. He sat down across from her without asking, set his helmet on the table. He had a long face, weathered, the kind of lines that came from squinting into sun and wind rather than from age. "You should know," he said, "that 3 of the staff in this hospital called the police when the shooting started. Dispatch has 4 units outside. Are they coming in? We've coordinated. They're holding the perimeter." He paused. "It's a federal situation now. The FBI field office in Denver has been notified." She absorbed that. What was Calloway carrying? Thorne looked at her steadily. "What makes you think he was carrying something?" "Because they followed a military helicopter to a civilian hospital and sent 3 people in after him. They weren't trying to finish what the ambush started. If that was the goal, they had cleaner options. They wanted something he had." Thorne was quiet. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "I'm not asking because I need to know. I'm asking because if whatever he's carrying is still somewhere in this building, your perimeter problem isn't solved yet." Another pause. Longer. He was deciding something. Evidence package. Documents and a drive. He was transporting it to a secure facility when the ambush happened. "Is it on him?" "It was. Field team secured it when we extracted him." A slight shift in his posture. "It's with my people." "Then you're good." "Maybe." He looked at his helmet. "Doesn't mean they know that." She considered that. He was right. The people who'd sent 3 men into a hospital wouldn't know their asset had already been secured, which meant the building was still a target until someone made the calculation that the operation had failed. "How long does that take?" she asked. "Before they stand down?" "Depends on who's running it." He met her eyes. "Could be an hour. Could be they already know and there's nobody else coming. Could be they're waiting to see if the 3 inside make contact." Which they won't." "Which they won't," he agreed. She drank the coffee. It was terrible, the break room machine having never been cleaned properly in the time she'd worked there. She drank it anyway. "I need to ask you something," Thorne said. She waited. "Your discharge papers. You listed your MOS as 68 Whiskey Combat Medic, attached to 10th Group for 14 months. He folded his hands on the table. "But your file has a gap, 8 months between your last deployment rotation and your discharge date." She was still. "I'm not asking you to fill it in," he said. "I don't need you to. But I want you to understand that I've been trying to figure out why your name came up in connection with Calloway's unit, and whatever was in that gap is clearly the reason." She set the cup down. "Who gave you my name?" "Calloway's CO. When we briefed the situation and gave the location, he said, and I'm quoting, 'If Evelyn Hayes is anywhere near that hospital, get her in the room.'" Thorne's expression didn't shift much, but something in it changed slightly. He said it like he'd been waiting for the chance. She looked at the wall for a moment, at the corkboard with the staff appreciation certificates and the printed out reminder about the upcoming parking lot resurfacing, the small, ordinary texture of a place she'd spent 2 years trying to fit into by being quieter and smaller than she actually was. "Calloway's unit," she said finally. 3 years ago, FOB Whitmore." Thorne went still. FOB Whitmore was the kind of name that, in certain circles, produced a specific quality of silence. "There was an ambush," she said. "We lost comms, lost our vehicle, and I had 6 casualties in a drainage ditch for 4 hours before extract came." She kept her voice level, not because it was easy, but because she'd learned to make it level a long time ago, and the habit was bone deep now. "I don't know what's in my file from those months because I was told it was classified and I believed them. I still believe them." She looked at him. "Calloway was one of the 6. Thorne said nothing for a long moment. "Is that why you left?" he asked. Careful. Not pushing exactly, just asking. "I left," she said, "because I was done." Because I'd given 14 months of myself and I wanted to try something that wasn't that. She gestured vaguely at the air. This. I wanted to help people without the other parts. And how's that working out? Something that might have been a very tired laugh moved across her face. About as well as today looks. His radio crackled. He listened. A beat. Then he stood up, and his expression had changed. Not alarmed exactly, but sharper. What? She said. Hospital administrator just came downstairs, Thorne said. He's talking to the FBI agents who just arrived. Apparently he's got documentation he wants to share. He picked up his helmet. Documentation about a nurse who was terminated today for patient safety violations. Evelyn was still. He's trying to get you removed from the building, Thorne said. Formally. She looked at him, then at the corkboard, at the parking lot resurfacing notice, absurdly, as if it was anchoring her to something real. He doesn't know who I am, she said. It wasn't a question. It was more like something clicking into place. He knows you're a nurse he fired 4 hours ago who is currently operating in his hospital without authorization. Thorne's voice was even. He doesn't know anything else yet. And the FBI? Haven't been briefed on you yet. That's happening in... He checked his watch. Probably 10 minutes. 10 minutes. She could hear the administrator's voice distantly now, somewhere down the hall, the particular cadence of a man who'd spent a career speaking with false authority and had learned to make it sound real. She thought about Holt's folder, the documented write-ups, the PIP she'd refused to sign, 2 years of being right about things that got written up as attitude problems. She thought about Gerald Pruitt, coding in Bay 7 while his chart sat there with every warning she'd filed. She thought about room 714 and the patient she'd flagged on her way out, and whether anyone had looked at that chart in the hours since. And she thought about the fact that somewhere in this building, 3 men who'd been sent to retrieve or destroy evidence were zip-tied on the floor because she had known which door to open and when. She stood up. "Where's the administrator now?" she asked. Thorne watched her. Conference room B, 2nd floor. She knew conference room B. She'd been in it that afternoon, across the table from Holt and Stiles, watching someone build a case out of the wrong materials. And the FBI agents? With him, 2 of them. A pause. Hayes. She looked at him. "Don't do anything that makes my job harder," he said. But the way he said it wasn't exactly a warning. It was more like a man who'd already decided to step back and see what happened next. She walked out of the break room. The corridor was quieter now, the immediate crisis absorbed into the strange calm that always followed, the aftermath hum of a building that had been through something and was slowly realizing it was still standing. Staff moved in small clusters. A patient's TV was audible through a closed door, some afternoon program running oblivious. At the far end of the hall, near the elevator bank, she saw Dr. Holt. He was on his phone, pacing, and he saw her at the same moment she saw him. Something moved across his face. Surprise, then something harder, then the particular rearrangement of a man reaching for his authority like a tool he wasn't sure still worked. He ended the call. She kept walking toward him because the elevator was in that direction and she wasn't going to change course to avoid him. He stepped slightly into her path, not blocking her exactly, just occupying the space in a way that required acknowledgement. "I don't know how you're still in this building," he said, low. "But I've spoken to legal, and there are FBI agents downstairs who've been informed about your situation." "I know," she said. "I'm going to go meet them." He blinked. I have some things to tell them." She looked at him steadily. No anger. That was the thing that seemed to unsettle him most. Not her defiance, but her complete absence of distress. "About today. About the last 2 years. About room 714, which I'm going to check on first, because I don't think anyone else has." She pressed the elevator button. "You were terminated," he said, like saying it again would make it more structural. "I know what I was," she said. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. And as they closed, she caught a last glimpse of Holt standing in the corridor, phone at his side. The folder that had felt so substantial in the conference room this afternoon suddenly looking like exactly what it was: paper. The elevator descended. On the second floor, through the corridor she couldn't see yet, the FBI agents were sitting across a conference table from the hospital administrator, listening to a story about a disruptive nurse who'd had to be let go. The administrator had paperwork. He had documentation. He had 2 years of write-ups organized by date. What he didn't have, what nobody in that room had yet, was any idea what those 2 years actually looked like from the other side. That was about to change. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. And from somewhere above her, from the direction of the OR wing, a nurse's voice came sharp and fast over the floor. Intercom. Code blue. OR2. Code blue. OR2. Calloway. Evelyn was already moving before the second announcement finished. The stairs were faster than waiting for the elevator to cycle back up. Evelyn took them 2 at a time, which was not something she'd done in a hospital context in 2 years, and which her body remembered anyway. The specific controlled urgency of moving fast without running, because running in a hospital made everyone around you panic, and panic cost time. She hit the OR floor door at a push and came through into the scrub corridor where 2 nurses were already outside, OR2 with the controlled frantic energy of people managing a crisis on the other side of a closed door. "What happened?" she said. The closer nurse, scrub cap, mask pulled down, eyes above it showing stress, said, "V-fib arrest, intraoperative. He was stable, and then She gestured, the gesture meaning everything collapsed at once. "How long?" 2 minutes. Maybe 2.5. "Villanueva's running the code?" "Yes, but we're not getting conversion. We've shocked twice." Evelyn pushed through the door without explaining herself. Nobody stopped her. In a code, the people inside didn't have the bandwidth to check credentials. The OR was controlled chaos in the specific way ORs always were. Everyone with a role, everyone executing it, but underneath the execution a current of something that wasn't quite panic and wasn't quite not panic either. Calloway was open on the table, the surgical field exposed, his chest visibly still in the wrong way. Villanueva was at the head of the bed working the compressions himself, which told her the perfusionist wasn't in the room yet, and the anesthesiologist had his hands full managing the airway that had destabilized. The monitor showed the characteristic chaotic scrawl of ventricular fibrillation, which was the heart doing everything at once and therefore nothing at all. "Charged," the scrub tech said. "Clear." Villanueva stepped back. The shock hit. Everyone watched the monitor, sinus, for 4 seconds, then V-fib again. Villanueva swore under his breath and went back to compressions. He registered Evelyn's presence with one quick look and didn't send her out, which was its own kind of permission. "What's his mag?" she said to the anesthesiologist. Dr. Farrow, she'd worked with him twice, a thin man who was good under pressure but was currently managing 2 things at the threshold of his bandwidth. "Low, we're replacing it." "What about his ionized calcium?" A pause. "I don't have that number." "Get it." She moved to the medication table. "You've got a trauma patient who bled significantly and got multiple units of packed cells. Citrate binding depletes calcium, and hypocalcemia in an open chest is—" "I know what it is," Farrow said sharply. "Then get me the number." He pulled the last lab. Read it. Looked at her. The number was low enough that she watched something shift in his face. Not quite alarmed because he was too experienced for that, but the particular recalculation of a man realizing he'd been managing one problem while another one sat underneath it. 0.92, he said. "Give him a gram of calcium gluconate. Push it slow." She looked at Villanueva. "Keep compressions going until it's in." Villanueva didn't ask who she was. He kept compressions going. The calcium went in over 90 seconds. The room was tight and focused, and nobody spoke. The monitor continued its chaotic scrawl, and the sound it made was the kind of sound that lived in medical people's heads for longer than they wanted it to. That specific electronic alarm that meant the most fundamental thing had stopped working. "Charged," the tech said again. Villanueva stepped back. "Clear!" The shock hit. The monitor jumped, scrambled, and then, not cleanly, not in the way it happened in television where the line straightened and everyone exhaled, but haltingly, the way a real heart recovered, in irregular steps with a few bad beats before the rhythm organized itself into something that held. Sinus rhythm. Holding. Holding. The room breathed. Villanueva looked at the monitor for a full 5 seconds before he looked at anything else. Then he looked at Evelyn. His expression was complicated. Relief, irritation at the near miss, and something else she recognized as the specific discomfort of a physician who just had a correct clinical suggestion come from outside his chain of command. Calcium, he said, more to himself than to her. Massive transfusion protocol in a trauma patient, she said, not unkindly. It gets missed. He nodded once. A physician's nod that meant, "You're right, and I won't say so again." She didn't push it. She stepped back from the table and let the room reorganize around the patient, who was still critical, but was at least critical with a heartbeat. She was outside the OR 2 minutes later, back in the scrub corridor, and Captain Thorne was there. He'd heard the code call on the building's intercom and come up, and he was watching her with the same expression he'd had in the break room, that recalibration she kept catching. "He's back," she said. Thorne exhaled. One controlled breath, the kind that let something out without showing how much it had been held. "Okay." "He's not out of the woods. Villanueva's good, but it's going to be a long table." She stripped the gloves she'd grabbed from the box by the door. "What's happening downstairs?" He fell into step beside her. "Your administrator is still in with the FBI. He's been in there 40 minutes, and he has a significant amount of documentation." A pause. "He's not just trying to remove you from the building. He's filing a formal complaint. Unauthorized medical practice, potential patient endangerment." She stopped walking. "He's framing the Callaway resuscitation as rogue intervention by a terminated employee," Thorne said. "His version is that you inserted yourself into a trauma situation without authorization and that Villanueva allowed it because of the chaos." She looked at him. "Is Villanueva in that room?" "Not yet." "When he is, that version won't hold." "I know, but right now the FBI agents have his version and a stack of paper and no counter-narrative." He held her gaze. "I'm getting briefed into that room in the next 15 minutes. My CO authorized it an hour ago. The FBI field office knows about Callaway, knows about the operation, and knows that our team was here. What they don't know yet is the extent of your involvement." A beat. "Or your history." She understood what he was offering. The chance to have her history arrive in that room before the administrator's paperwork could fully define her. She'd spent 18 months not using who she'd been because she'd wanted to be something different. It turned out who she'd been had followed her anyway. "Tell them," she said. So, she didn't go to room 714 to hide. She went because she'd flagged that patient before she'd left and nobody else had looked at him, and whatever was happening in the conference room downstairs was happening without her, and she couldn't do anything about it by standing in a corridor watching a door. The patient in 714 was named Robert Ashby, 57, admitted 4 days ago for what his attending physician had classified as a severe anxiety disorder with somatic symptoms. He had a documented history of health anxiety, which was the kind of note that got attached to a chart and then subtly colored every subsequent clinical decision, because once someone was categorized, the category tended to do the interpreting. Evelyn had started noticing him 3 weeks ago. Not because she was assigned to his floor, she wasn't, she worked the ER, but because she'd been floated twice during a staffing shortage, and he'd been in 714 both times. And something about his symptom pattern had nagged at her the way certain things nagged at her when she couldn't immediately name why. Confusion that came and went, mild tremor in his left hand that his chart documented as anxiety-related. Blood pressure readings that ran low for a man his age and build, and a very faint, very particular smell. Not something she could have articulated in a chart note, more a pattern of things that added up to something her brain was trying to tell her. She knocked, opened the door. Robert Ashby was awake, lying at about 30 degrees, and he looked worse than he had 2 weeks ago. Not dramatically worse, the kind of subtle progression that was easy to miss if you weren't comparing against a baseline you'd memorized. His color was off. He tracked her face slowly when she came in. "You're not my usual nurse," he said. His speech was slightly slowed, not in the way of medication, more like he was choosing words carefully. "I floated up here a couple times. You might remember me." She moved to his chart on the wall tablet, pulled up the labs from that morning. "How are you feeling?" "Same." A pause. "Tired." "Any headache?" "Always." He said it the way people said things they'd stopped expecting to matter. She looked at his morning sodium. It was low. Not dangerously, but at the level where it should have prompted a question. And the note next to it from the attending said monitor. Not investigate. Monitor. She looked at the pattern across the days of admission. Slow, steady decline. Sodium. Chloride. Slightly elevated creatinine that was new as of 2 days ago. She looked at his morning cortisol, which the attending had ordered once and then not repeated despite the abnormal result. Her brain finished the sentence it had been trying to say for 3 weeks. She looked at him. "Has anyone talked to you about your adrenal function?" He blinked. "My what?" "Your adrenal glands. They regulate, among other things, your sodium and your stress response and your blood pressure." She kept her voice even, clinical, not alarming. "Has anyone brought that up?" "No." He was watching her with the particular attention of a sick person who'd been in a hospital for 4 days and had stopped expecting new information. "Should they?" "I think so." She looked at the chart again. The morning cortisol was 9. In a hospitalized patient under the stress of illness, it should have been significantly higher. A healthy stress response pushed cortisol up. His hadn't gone up. It had gone nowhere. She pulled up the attending's contact. Dr. Miriam Owens. Internal medicine, 3rd floor. She'd had one interaction with Owens, brief, pleasant enough. She sent a direct message through the hospital system. "This is Evelyn Hayes. I've been reviewing Ashby 714. I want to flag a possible adrenal insufficiency presentation. Sodium trend, low cortisol at 9 despite acute illness, orthostatic BP pattern, confusion. Requesting you look before end of shift. I know I'm not on this floor officially, but I'm in the building and I've had eyes on him across multiple float shifts. Happy to discuss." She hesitated over whether to note her current employment status. She sent it without that note. Then she sat down in the chair beside Ashby's bed. "Someone's going to come look at you," she told him. "Tonight." He looked at her. "Are you sure?" "I sent the message myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're the first person who's actually told me something since I got here." He said it without bitterness, just as fact. Everyone else just says they're monitoring. She understood the word monitoring in a hospital context. It meant, we see it and we're not ready to commit to it yet. Sometimes that was appropriate. Sometimes it was the clinical equivalent of looking at something uncomfortable and deciding not to look harder. "I know," she said. She stayed 4 minutes. Long enough to watch him, to verify her read on his color and his confusion pattern and the slight asymmetry in his grip when she handed him his water cup. Then she stood, told him she'd check back in, and left. In the hallway, she stood with her back against the wall for a moment and let herself feel the weight of the day. The meeting, the parking lot, Calloway's helicopter, the North Corridor, the OR, the code. And now this. It was a lot of weight. She'd been carrying it by moving, which was the only way she knew, but she could feel it. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Different prefix than Thorne's. She answered. "Hayes." The voice was older, command-weathered, the kind of deep, deliberate cadence that came from decades of making statements that affected people's lives. "Sergeant Hayes, this is Brigadier General Raymond Voss. I believe you've had quite a day." She straightened slightly, a reflex so deep of 40 minutes ago. A pause. Brief but significant. "The FBI field office in Ashcroft now has your full record, including F.O.B. Whitmore." She was quiet. "I should have done it when you discharged," he said. "I didn't, because the operation was ongoing and I made a decision that protected the mission at the cost of leaving your record incomplete. That was my call. I own it." Another pause. "It wasn't the right call." She leaned her head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent light had a slight flicker she'd never noticed before, or maybe she'd noticed it 100 times and just never had the spare moment to register it. "How long before you're here?" she asked. 2 hours. My aide is coordinating with Thorne." A beat. "Is Calloway stable?" "He coded in the OR. He's back. Villanueva's still in there." She paused. "He's going to make it." "Good." Something in the general's voice settled slightly. He He's got people who need him to make it. She didn't know if that meant a family or a unit or both, and she didn't ask. After she ended the call, she stood in the corridor for another 20 seconds, processing the phrase, "I own it," in the voice of a brigadier general, which was not a phrase she'd expected to hear in her life, and which landed with a complicated weight she couldn't fully sort yet. Then she heard the shouting from the stairwell. Tisha. It wasn't the tactical kind of shouting, which would have put her in a different mode immediately. It was administrative shouting, the specific pitch of someone who felt their authority being challenged and was responding by volume, which was an authority move that only worked on people who were already inclined to yield. She pushed through the stairwell door on the 3rd floor and looked down. One flight below, in the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors, Dr. Holt was blocking the passage of 2 people she didn't recognize. A man and a woman, both in civilian clothes, both with the particular compact purposefulness of federal agents who had somewhere to be and were currently being impeded. "I am the chief of medicine of this hospital," Holt was saying, "and you cannot move through this building without going through me, sir." The woman's voice was flat and final. "We've been authorized by your hospital's legal counsel and the FBI field office to access all floors. If you'd like to confirm that with your legal team, you're welcome to step aside and make that call, but you are not cleared to impede a federal investigation." "This is my hospital, sir." Evelyn started down the stairs. Holt heard her and turned, and his face cycled through recognition, outrage, and the beginning of something that might have been the first real doubt she'd seen in him. "You," he said. How are you still?" "FBI?" she said to the 2 agents, ignoring him. The woman turned, 50s, sharp-eyed, the kind of face that filed everything. "Special Agent Reyes, FBI Denver Field Office." She didn't ask who Evelyn was. She looked at her like she'd already been briefed. "You're Hayes." "Yes." "We need to speak with you." Holt stepped forward. "She is a terminated employee. She has no standing here. She's been practicing medicine without a current—" "Dr. Holt." Agent Reyes turned to him with the specific patience of someone who had handled obstruction before and found it tedious. "We have your personnel documentation. We have the write-ups, the PIP, the termination. We also have patient records going back 26 months that are now part of an active federal inquiry." She held his gaze. "I'd suggest you contact your attorney." The sentence landed like something physical. Holt's mouth closed. "An active inquiry into what?" he said, finally. His voice had changed, not gone quiet with guilt, more with the particular register of someone realizing the ground under them had shifted and they couldn't yet see how far. "That's not something I'm able to discuss with you," Agent Reyes said. She looked at Evelyn. "Ms. Hayes, if you'll come with us." Evelyn came down the last few stairs. She passed Holt at close range, close enough that she could see the fine detail of his expression, the way the certainty that had defined every interaction she'd had with him over 2 years was cracking at the edges, letting something uncertain through. She didn't say anything to him. She didn't need to. The conference room on the 2nd floor had been reorganized since that afternoon. The same table, the same carpet cleaner smell, but different people in it now. Agent Reyes's partner, a man named Galloway, who was writing in a notebook by hand, and Captain Thorne, who sat at the far end of the table and gave Evelyn a brief nod when she came in. Administrator Dennis Pryor was not in the room. He was, according to what Thorne told her quietly when she sat down, currently in the administrator's office on the 4th floor, also in conversation with an attorney, which had happened very quickly after Thorne's briefing had reached the FBI agents. Evelyn sat. Agent Reyes sat across from her. "I want to start by clarifying something," Reyes said. "You are not under investigation. You are a witness and a subject of retaliation, and the distinction matters." She opened a folder. "We've been looking at Redstone Regional Medical Center for 4 months. Billing irregularities, procurement fraud, and a pattern of staff terminations that appears to correlate with employees flagging patient safety concerns." Evelyn was still. 6 nurses and 2 physicians in 30 months, Reyes said, all terminated within 4 to 8 weeks of filing formal safety complaints. Most signed NDAs as part of their severance. You didn't. I didn't take the severance. We know. Reyes looked at her. We have your documentation, every flag you filed, every patient note, every incident report. We pulled them this afternoon under the inquiry authority. A beat. You were right, every time. The room was very quiet. Not the kind of quiet that meant nothing was happening. The kind that meant something was happening that was too large for ordinary noise. The billing fraud is the primary case, Reyes continued. But the pattern of silencing safety complaints is its own charge. Administrator Pryor and Dr. Holt are both named in the preliminary filing. She closed the folder. Your record from the Army was transmitted to us an hour ago by General Voss's office. We've reviewed it. She paused, and something in her otherwise professional expression shifted slightly. F.O.B. Whitmore. Yes, Evelyn said. You held 6 casualties for 4 hours in an unsecured position, and all 6 survived. It was the right drainage ditch, Evelyn said. It was the kind of thing that came out when the pressure was wrong. The flat, slightly dark humor of someone who'd processed the event enough to find the absurd detail of it. It wasn't funny. It was just true. And true was the only register she could manage right now. Agent Galloway looked up from his notebook for the first time. Reyes said, The charges against you, the ones Pryor tried to file this afternoon, have been formally declined by the U.S. Attorney's Office, as of 30 minutes ago. She said it without fanfare. Your nursing license is not under threat, and the FBI is formally requesting your cooperation as a witness in the federal case against Redstone Regional Medical Center, its administrator, and named medical staff. Evelyn absorbed all of that. I have a patient I flagged on 7/14, she said. Robert Ashby, possible adrenal insufficiency. I messaged his attending, but I don't know if she's seen it. Reyes blinked. It was clearly not what she'd expected the first response to be. Thorne, from the far end of the table, made a sound that might have been a very quiet laugh. We can check on that, Reyes said. Good. Evelyn looked at the table for a moment. I'll cooperate. Whatever you need, whenever you need it. She looked up. But I need to know my patients are being looked after while this is happening, because that's why I was here in the first place, and that doesn't stop being true because everything else changed. Reyes held her gaze for a beat, then she wrote something in her own notebook. Noted, she said. The door to the conference room opened. A soldier appeared. Not Thorne's team, different unit patch, different energy. The kind of calm that came from very high clearance and direct orders from someone with significant rank. He looked at Thorne first, then at Evelyn. Ma'am, General Voss's convoy is 30 minutes out. He's requesting you be present when he arrives. A brief pause. He also asked me to tell you something. She waited. The soldier looked faintly uncomfortable, in the way of someone delivering a message they didn't fully understand the weight of. He said, Whitmore's been recognized. It's about time. The room was still. Even Agent Reyes, who had no context for what the words meant, seemed to understand from the quality of the silence that they meant something significant. Evelyn didn't respond for a moment. She was looking at the wall, the same kind of institutional beige that hospitals and conference rooms and military briefing rooms all seem to share, as if the people who designed places where hard things happened had agreed on a color that didn't demand anything from you. 30 minutes. She had 30 minutes until a brigadier general arrived at a hospital that had fired her 8 hours ago. She thought about Calloway on the table upstairs. She thought about Ashby in 714. She thought about the 6 people in the write-ups Reyes had read, the nurses and physicians who'd filed safety concerns and been quietly removed, who'd probably signed their NDAs and disappeared into their next jobs, carrying the weight of institutions that had taught them their instincts weren't worth the trouble. She was about to ask what would happen next when her phone buzzed. Paula, from the ER. She picked up. Hayes? Evelyn. Paula's voice was tight. I need you to come down. Now. What happened? The patient in Bay 7, Gerald Pruitt. A brief pause, and in that pause, Evelyn could hear the sound of a monitor, of activity, of something happening on the other side. He's coding, and there's someone here, from outside. I can't explain it. Just come. Evelyn was already standing. There's a man in the ER, Paula said, voice dropping. He came in through the ambulance bay 20 minutes ago. We thought he was a patient, but Evelyn, another pause, shorter, worse. He's not. And he's been in here the whole time. And I think he's been watching which rooms have military personnel in them. The sentence finished. The conference room was already in motion behind her, Thorne on his radio, Agent Reyes on her feet, but Evelyn was through the door before any of them said a word, moving fast down the corridor toward the stairwell, the familiar cold dread of something unfinished sitting in her chest. Because a fourth attacker in the ER, 20 feet from a population of vulnerable patients, was an entirely different problem than 3 men in a corridor. And Gerald Pruitt was coding, and whoever was in that bay had been watching and waiting, and nobody had seen him until now. The stairwell door hit the wall behind her, and she was already at the next landing before it swung back. 3 floors down. Her footsteps on the metal stairs were loud, and she didn't care. Loud was fine. Loud meant she was moving. The ER floor door opened into the back corridor of the department, the one that ran behind the nurse station and connected the trauma bays to the supply corridor. Evelyn came through it fast, and Paula was right there, waiting, or maybe just happening to be close, and grabbed her arm. "Bay 4, Paula said, low and tight. "He's sitting in 4. He came in saying chest pain. We triaged him, put him on a monitor. Everything looked borderline. We kept him." A breath. "About 15 minutes ago, I noticed he kept looking out the bay curtain every time someone moved in the hall. Not like a nervous patient, different." "Does he know you noticed?" "I don't think so. I sent the other nurse for a 12 lead that we didn't actually need, just to have a reason to be away from him." Smart. Evelyn looked down the corridor. She could see the bay curtains. 4 of them pulled, the light behind each one showing occupation. Bay 7 was at the far end, and she could hear the monitor alarm from here, which meant the code on Pruitt was still active or had just been called. "Who's running Pruitt's code?" "Dr. Osmond. She's been in there 6 minutes. Paula's voice dropped further. She called it herself. She saw the deterioration and called it without waiting for Holt. Kira Osmond. The second-year resident who'd told Evelyn the attending said she was overcautious. Something about that landed differently now. "Okay." Evelyn looked at Bay 4. The curtain was still. "What's he got on him?" "He came in with a jacket. We got the jacket off him because of the chest pain protocol, standard BP check. But," Paula paused. "Evelyn, when I moved the jacket, it was heavy. On the inside left. I didn't look directly, but I know what heavy on the inside left means." She did too. Thorne's people were 3 floors up. Evelyn's phone was already in her hand, Thorne's number already dialing as she moved toward the nurse station and positioned herself where she had a sight line to Bay 4 without being visible to whoever was inside it. Thorne picked up in 2 rings. Hayes, 4th man, ER Bay 4, presenting as chest pain. Armed, probable concealment on his left side. He's been in here at least 15 minutes watching patient movement. A short silence. Copy. 2 of my people are on the 2nd floor, getting them moving now. A beat. Do not engage. Keep the bay staffed, but don't pull him. I have a code running in Bay 7 and the Bay 4 patient already on a monitor. If I pull staff from 4, it'll flag immediately. Then keep 1 person with him. Just 1. Can you do that? She looked at Paula, who was watching her with the expression of someone who'd already decided to follow whatever came next. Yes. 4 minutes, Thorne said, and was gone. 4 minutes. In the bay, Pruitt was still in crisis, and if Kira Osmond was running that code alone, she needed bodies. Evelyn did a fast accounting of the ER floor. 2 nurses at station, 1 in Bay 4 with the man who was probably armed, 1 with Osmond in 7, and the overnight tech who was currently at the far end of the hall checking on a pediatric patient in Bay 1. She crossed to the nurse station. The nurse there, a man named Davis who'd been on nights for 3 years and had the steady energy of someone who didn't startle easily, looked at her without asking why she was there. Bay 7 needs another set of hands, she said. Go. He went. She slid into the station seat, pulled the monitoring view for Bay 4 onto the secondary screen. The man's rhythm was showing exactly the right amount of ambiguity, something that would justify his triage, something that in a busy ER could be read a dozen ways. Not dramatic enough to require immediate intervention, not clean enough to discharge. The perfect amount of borderline. It wasn't chest pain, it was cover. He'd positioned himself to wait. She thought about the three men in the north corridor, the deliberateness of their civilian clothes, the way they'd moved. This operation had layers. The ambush on Calloway had failed. The three-man incursion into the hospital had failed. But whoever was running this had a fourth piece already in place before the first three had gone in, and that fourth piece was still sitting in Bay 4 waiting for some signal that was never going to come. The question was what he'd do when he decided it wasn't coming. She watched the monitor. His heart rate was elevated, not dangerously, just the specific elevation of a person who was tense. 2 minutes passed. Paula stayed at the edge of the corridor, pretending to chart. The overnight tech came back up the hall, and Evelyn caught her eye and shook her head slightly. "Stay away." And the tech, whose name was Rosario, and who was perceptive enough to read the room, diverted into the supply closet without breaking stride. At the 1-minute mark, the curtain on Bay 4 moved. Not much, just a shift, the kind that meant someone inside had changed position, maybe leaned forward, maybe looked out. Evelyn kept her eyes on the monitor screen. She didn't look directly at the bay. The curtain stilled. Her phone buzzed. Text from Thorne. 30 seconds. Hold. She held. The door at the far end of the ER corridor opened. 2 people in civilian clothes. Thorne's people, she realized, who'd changed jackets, which was fast thinking because scrubs and tactical gear in an ER corridor would have flagged immediately. They moved like hospital visitors who knew where they were going, purposeful, without urgency, and she tracked them in her peripheral vision as they separated, one toward the nurse station, one angling toward the bay side of the hall. The one who came to the station leaned on the counter like he was asking a question. Up close, he was young, maybe 26, with the particular stillness of someone running entirely on training. He said quietly, "Which bay?" She tilted her head slightly left. 4. Jacket's on the hook inside the curtain, left inside panel. He's on the monitor, so there'll be an alarm if the leads disconnect. He nodded, like she'd told him about a medication dosage. Then he straightened and walked toward Bay 4 at the pace of someone who'd been told to check on a patient. She watched the monitor. The heart rate in Bay 4 spiked suddenly. 15 beats in about 3 seconds, the sharp climb of someone who'd just realized something was wrong. Then the leads disconnected, all of them at once, and the monitor screamed, and there was a sound from behind the curtain that was brief and controlled and ended quickly. Paula flinched, then quiet. The soldier appeared at the edge of the curtain and looked at the nurse station. He held up one hand, palm out, and nodded. Done. Evelyn's breath came out slowly. She hadn't noticed she'd been holding it. From Bay 7, she heard Kira Osmond's voice. "I've got a rhythm. Sinus. Come on, hold." And the monitor in 7 steadied into the jagged but present sound of a real heartbeat, and Davis said something low and relieved, and Osmond said, Okay, let's get him stabilized. I'm calling cardiology." Evelyn put her face in her hands for exactly 4 seconds. It was all she allowed herself. Then she took them away and stood up and walked toward Bay 7. Gerald Pruitt survived. Kira Osmond had caught the deterioration on her own, had gone back to his chart after the meeting, after Evelyn's comment about room 714 and the patient she'd flagged, had apparently rattled something loose in her, and she'd looked at the notes Evelyn had written 2 weeks ago. And then she'd looked at Pruitt's current readings, and she'd made the call herself. Without Holt. Without waiting for permission. It had made the difference. Evelyn stood outside Bay 7 while the cardiology team worked, and she felt something she couldn't easily name. Not pride exactly, because Osmond had done this herself. More like the particular satisfaction of something that had been ignored for a long time finally being seen. Thorne appeared beside her. "All 4 are in custody. FBI took the 4th one from the ER. He looked at the bay. "Patient's going to be okay?" "Looks like it." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. "General Voss is 20 minutes out. His team called ahead. He wants a full assembly on the main floor when he arrives. Staff, FBI agents, whatever administration is still in the building." "Pryor's still here?" "Pryor's in his office with his attorney and 2 FBI agents who are not his attorney." A beat. "Holt is in the break room on 3. Apparently someone told him to wait there, and he's been waiting." She turned to look at him. "Who told him to wait there?" Thorne's expression was carefully neutral. One of my people mentioned that the FBI wanted to speak with everyone before they left the building. That was accurate. The implication that he should specifically wait in the break room was a slight pause, not explicitly stated. She looked at him for a moment. You've been managing this pretty carefully. I've been making sure the situation resolved with minimal additional damage, he said. There's a difference. She wasn't entirely sure there was, but she let it go. In the next 40 minutes, the building reorganized itself around what had happened the way buildings did. Not cleanly, not in any narrative way, but in the specific accumulation of small events that added up to a shift. The FBI agents moved through the floors with the quiet efficiency of people executing a plan they'd already prepared before today, which confirmed what Reyes had said about the 4-month inquiry. They weren't here because of today. Today had just accelerated a timeline that was already moving. Medical records were flagged on the third-floor server. Evelyn saw the IT administrator, a mild man named Torres who looked genuinely distressed, being walked through the process of preserving the data in a form that couldn't be altered. She heard Reyes's partner Galloway explaining chain of custody to someone. She watched an agent carry a box of physical files from the administrator's office. She checked on Ashby in 714. Dr. Owens had been there. The message had gotten through, and Owens had ordered a full adrenal panel, a cortisol stimulation test, and had started him on stress-dose hydrocortisone while they waited for results. Ashby was sitting up slightly straighter. His confusion was already marginally less visible, which was too fast for the medication to be doing it, more likely the effect of someone finally paying attention. "Told you?" Evelyn said from the doorway. He looked at her. "The other doctor came." "I know." "She said you sent the message." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why?" "You didn't have to. You don't even work on this floor." She thought about how to answer that. "Because it bothered me," she said finally. "And when something bothers me clinically, I don't leave it alone." He looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been in a hospital for 4 days waiting for someone to say something real. "That's it?" "That's it." She left him there and went back to the stairwell because Thorne had texted that Voss was 10 minutes out and she needed to be on the main floor. 10. The lobby of Redstone Regional Medical Center had never been designed for assembly. It was built for flow. People coming in, people going out, the transactional movement of a medical facility. The seating was minimal and the floor space wasn't really space, it was passage. But somehow, in the way of things that were happening with more intention than they appeared to, there were people on the main floor when Evelyn came down. Nursing staff, some of the ER team, 2 of the surgical nurses from Villanueva's OR residence, administrative staff who'd come down from the upper floors, some because they'd been called, and some because word moved fast in a building under federal investigation, and people wanted to know what was happening. Agent Reyes was there, and Galloway. Thorne's team, minus the 2 managing the 4 people now in FBI custody. Holt was there. Someone had apparently told him the waiting was over. He stood near the back with the posture of a man who'd spent the last 2 hours on the phone with an attorney and had emerged less certain than when he'd gone in. He didn't look at her when she came into the lobby. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at the floor. Pryor was not there yet. Outside, through the glass of the main entrance, headlights. The convoy was 3 vehicles. Not dramatic, not theatrical, but the specific understated weight of military presence that didn't need theater to make itself felt. 2 vehicles flanked a third, and the people who got out of the flanking vehicles moved in the practiced way of people whose job was to know what was around them at all times. Brigadier General Raymond Voss got out of the middle vehicle. He was in his 60s, compact, with the kind of bearing that didn't require height to occupy a room. Gray at the temples, service ribbons on his chest, and the face of someone who had long since stopped performing authority and simply had it. He walked through the sliding doors of Redstone Regional Medical Center at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday without breaking his pace, and the lobby reorganized itself around his entry the way air reorganized around something moving through it. He saw Evelyn immediately. He crossed to her without preamble. And what happened next was something she hadn't prepared for because she hadn't let herself imagine it. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, came to attention, and saluted. Clean, formal, the kind of salute that in military context carried weight far beyond the gesture itself. Behind him, every soldier in the lobby matched it. The lobby was very quiet. She returned it. Her arm knew how. 18 months of civilian life hadn't taken that from her body. He dropped his hand. She dropped hers. "You look like you've had a bad day," he said. "Not entirely," she said. Something moved across his face that was close to a smile but more complicated than one. "No, not entirely." He turned slightly, addressing the room without theatrical announcement, the way someone spoke when they assumed they'd be heard and didn't need to perform it. "My name is Raymond Voss, and I'm here because this hospital and the people in it intersected with a federal military operation today in ways that are going to require a great deal of explanation." He paused. "But before the explanation, there's something this room should know." The quiet deepened. "The nurse who was terminated from this facility this afternoon," he said, "is former Staff Sergeant Evelyn Hayes, United States Army, combat medic, attached to 10th Special Forces Group. Her record, which has been classified until this evening, includes 14 months of active deployment, multiple combat operations, and a specific action at Forward Operating Base Whitmore 3 years ago, in which she held 6 critically wounded soldiers in an unsecured position for 4 hours under intermittent fire, performed field surgery without proper equipment, and brought every one of those men home alive." He let that settle for exactly 2 seconds. "Major Daniel Calloway, who is currently in your OR, is one of those men. He recognized your hospital's name when the pilot called in. He specifically requested that if Evelyn Hayes was anywhere in this area, she be located." Another pause. "She was. She'd been in your parking lot for 11 minutes when our aircraft arrived." Nobody spoke. Holt, near the back, had gone the particular color of someone whose blood pressure was doing something interesting. He was looking at the floor again, but differently than before. Not the avoidance of someone not wanting to make eye contact, more the stunned vacancy of someone whose framework for understanding a situation had just collapsed entirely. Voss looked at Agent Reyes. "Your inquiry." Reyes stepped forward. She had a tablet in her hand and she referenced it without looking at it much. "Redstone Regional Medical Center is the subject of a federal investigation into Medicare and Medicaid billing fraud, medical supply procurement fraud, and a systematic pattern of retaliatory termination against clinical staff who filed patient safety complaints. The estimated fraudulent billing over a 30-month period is approximately $4.3 million. She glanced up. "Administrator Dennis Pryor and Chief of Medicine Dr. Marcus Holt are named in the preliminary filing. Arrest warrants were issued as of 6:30 this evening." The lobby absorbed that. One of the administrative staff near the back said involuntarily, "4 million," and then stopped. Holt looked up. His face had moved through several expressions and landed on something that was trying to be outrage and not quite achieving it. "There's been no due process here. This is all—" "Dr. Holt," Reyes looked at him calmly. "You're welcome to continue that sentence with your attorney present. Do you want me to have someone bring him to this room?" Holt closed his mouth. The elevator on the far side of the lobby opened. Dennis Pryor stepped out with his attorney, a man in an expensive jacket who looked like he'd arrived from Denver in a hurry, and 2 FBI agents who were positioned with the specific deliberateness of people who were not exactly escorting someone and not exactly not escorting them. Pryor took in the lobby. The soldiers, the federal agents, the staff, Voss, and Evelyn Hayes standing in the middle of it. He'd met her once in a hallway, 3 months ago. She'd been delivering a patient complaint form to the administrative desk, and he'd looked through her the way administrators looked through clinical staff, when there was no immediate reason not to. She remembered it because she'd noted his expression, the particular blankness of someone for whom the people running the machines were scenery. He didn't look through her now. "Mr. Pryor," Reyes said. "The warrant." His attorney said something low and urgent near his ear. Pryor's jaw tightened. He was a man of about 60 who had the expensive grooming of someone used to managing appearances, and the appearances were not managing themselves well right now. He looked at his attorney. His attorney shook his head slightly, the specific shake of someone saying, "Don't." Agent Galloway produced the warrant, handed it to the attorney. Pryor looked at Evelyn for a long moment. She couldn't read everything in his expression. There was too much compressed into it, and some of it was probably things she didn't care about, like the specific calculations of a man weighing options. But underneath it, there was something she recognized, because she'd seen it in people who'd been certain of their position right up until the moment they weren't. The look of someone realizing, too late, that the structure they'd built their certainty on had been hollow the whole time. He looked away. "We'll need to continue this at the federal building," Reyes said to the attorney. "You and your client both." They went. Holt was arrested 20 minutes later. Not in the lobby, that would have been theater, and Reyes didn't seem interested in theater. An agent came and said they needed him to come downstairs to a vehicle, and he went, and the arrest itself happened quietly in the parking lot where Evelyn had sat in her car 6 hours ago, wondering whether to start the engine. She didn't witness it. She was in the ER when it happened, checking on Pruitt, who was awake and bewildered and had his wife sitting next to him, holding his hand with the grip of someone who'd gotten a phone call 3 hours ago that she hadn't fully recovered from. Pruitt looked at Evelyn when she came in. He didn't know who she was. He'd been unconscious through most of the relevant events, but his wife had talked to Paula in the hallway, and Paula had apparently given her a version of events because the wife looked at Evelyn with an expression that was too complicated and too full for the situation they were technically in. A stranger in a hospital bay, checking a chart. "You flagged him," the wife said. 2 weeks ago. "I documented a concern, yes." And nobody listened. Evelyn looked at Pruitt's chart. His rhythm was stable. The cardiology team had already been in and had a plan. He was going to need a procedure, but he was going to need it in a controlled setting with time to prepare, not in a crash code situation with a resident running on instinct. "Someone listened tonight," Evelyn said. "The resident who ran his code." She went back and looked at the notes. She looked at the wife. She caught it. The wife was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Evelyn said. "It's supposed to be accurate." She left them there and went back to the corridor, where the ER had settled into its late-night rhythm, the specific, quieter, more tired version of itself that emerged after midnight, with fewer people and more fluorescent light, and the sense of a building that had been through something large and was now simply continuing to function because continuing to function was what it did. Thorne found her near the nurse station. He had coffee, 2 cups, and handed her one without asking. She took it. "Calloway's out of the OR," he said. "Villanueva says it went as well as it could have. He's in recovery." "Good." "He's asking for you." She looked up. "I told his nurse we'd pass that along," Thorne said. "He's not in a condition to have a long conversation, but he wanted to know if you were in the building." She drank the coffee, better than the break room machine. Thorne had found it somewhere that actually cleaned their equipment. "I'll go up." "Give it an hour. Let them get him settled." She nodded. "There's something else," he said. His voice had changed register slightly. Still even, but with the quality of someone leading into something they'd been thinking about how to say. The evidence package Calloway was transporting. "The documents and the drive." "Yes, my CO briefed me fully tonight." He looked at his cup. "The fraud case you're a witness in, the billing, the procurement. The FBI has been building it for 4 months, as Reyes told you." A pause. "What they didn't tell you, because they're still verifying it, is that part of the procurement fraud at this hospital involved a defense contractor, medical supply contracts, inflated invoices, kickbacks through a shell company." He met her eyes. "The operation that ambushed Calloway today was not unrelated to this hospital." She was very still. "He was carrying documentation that connected the contractor to at least 3 other facilities running the same scheme," Thorne said. Redstone was the smallest node. The contractor was using the billing fraud infrastructure here as a template. He paused. Pryor knew. He's not just a hospital administrator who got greedy. He was a participant in something significantly larger. The coffee in her hands was warm, and she focused on that for a moment. The specific physical fact of warm in her palms because the information she was absorbing was the kind that needed something concrete to anchor it. How large? She said. That's what Calloway's drive was going to answer. A beat. It still will, once forensics processes it. But the people who sent those 4 men today knew what was on it. They sent the men because the drive being processed meant people were going to be identifiable. He paused. Pryor didn't send them. He's not that kind of player. But he knew what was coming. His attorney contact tonight, the one he called from his office, was not a defense attorney. She looked at him. He was warning someone. The FBI has the call log. Yes. The lobby, an hour ago, felt different now. The clean narrative of a corrupt administrator being brought down felt not wrong exactly, but like one layer of something with more layers underneath it, which was how these things usually worked, and she knew that, but knowing it didn't make it simpler. Does this change anything tonight? She asked. Not for you. The fraud case, your testimony, your record, none of that changes. He looked at the corridor. It means the FBI's case is larger than they knew this morning, which means their interest in what happened here today is larger. A pause. Your name is in a federal file that is now very significant, Hayes. You understand that. She understood that. She also understood that she was tired in the specific way that went past physical, the kind of tired that came from a day that had required every version of herself simultaneously, the nurse and the soldier and the person who'd spent 18 months trying to pretend those were separate things. She drank the rest of the coffee. Is there anything you need from me tonight? She said. Reyes will have a formal statement process tomorrow morning. Nothing tonight. Tonight is... He gestured vaguely at the building, at the ongoing work of it. Tonight is still ongoing. She handed him back the cup, looked at the Bay assignments board, looked at the time. I'm going to check on my patients, she said. He almost said something. She could see it. The slight pause, the intake of breath. Maybe something about how they weren't technically her patients, about her employment status, about any of the procedural realities that were still technically true. He didn't say it. I'll have someone bring you upstairs when Calloway's ready, he said instead. She walked down the corridor. She was 3 bays in, checking a chart that Paula had flagged for her. An elderly woman who'd come in during the evening chaos with a fall injury and had been parked in Bay 3 with an ice pack and not much else while the rest of the ER handled the crisis. When her phone buzzed. Unknown number, not the military exchange, a local area code. She answered. Hayes. Silence for 2 seconds. Then a voice she didn't immediately recognize, a woman's voice, tense and low, speaking quickly. Ms. Hayes, my name is Sandra Okafor. I'm a nurse. I worked at Redstone until 8 months ago. Evelyn was still. One of the 6, the ones who'd signed NDAs. I heard something happen tonight, Sandra said. Someone called me. I can't say much because I signed an agreement, but I need you to know... A pause. A shaky breath. The kind that came from holding it in for too long. I filed 17 patient safety complaints in the 8 months before they fired me. 17. And I have copies of everything. I kept copies. My lawyer told me I shouldn't, but I kept them anyway because I knew someday... She stopped. Sandra, Evelyn said carefully, you need to call the FBI tonight. Agent Reyes. I can give you her direct number. I know, Another breath. I needed to hear that it's real first, that it's actually happening. Evelyn looked at Bay 3, at the elderly woman with the ice pack who'd been waiting patiently in the chaos for someone to come back to her, and she said, It's real. It's happening. She paused. Call Reyes. Tell her you have copies. She'll know what to do with them. Sandra was quiet for a moment, then, Did they really arrest Holt? Yes. Another silence, longer. Okay, Sandra said, like the word was something she'd been holding back for 8 months. Okay. She ended the call. Evelyn pocketed her phone and went into Bay 3 and introduced herself to the woman with the ice pack. Her name was Harriet. She was 73, She'd fallen in her kitchen, and her daughter had brought her in, and the daughter had been sitting with her until the lockdown protocols had separated them. And she pulled up the x-rays that had been ordered 2 hours ago and hadn't been reviewed by a physician yet because the physician who should have reviewed them had been occupied with other things. She looked at the films. The hip was intact, a relief given Harriet's age, but the wrist had a fracture, distal radius, that was going to need a splint and probably an orthopedic follow-up, and whoever was supposed to have handled this in the last 2 hours hadn't. She went to find Kira Osman. Osman was at the nurse station writing notes, and she looked up when Evelyn arrived. The resident's face had moved significantly since their early interaction. The uncertain deference of a second year, who'd learned to doubt her own instincts, was still there, but it was overlaid now by something that had been tested and had held. She'd run a code tonight. She'd run it correctly. Bay 3, Evelyn said. Harriet, her wrist needs to be read and splinted. Can you take that? Osman looked at her, not deferentially, more directly than that. Yeah, I'll get to her. She's been waiting 2 hours. I know. A pause. I'll go now. Evelyn nodded, started to turn. Hayes? Osman's voice stopped her. She turned back. The resident was looking at her with the expression of someone choosing whether to say something. I went back and looked at Pruitt's chart after the meeting this afternoon, because of what you said when you left. Evelyn waited. You were right, Osman said. I should have looked harder the first time. When Dr. Holt told me you were overcautious, She stopped. I should have looked harder. You looked hard enough tonight, Evelyn said. Osman's jaw tightened slightly, not in the way of someone pushing back, in the way of someone holding something in that they'd need to figure out how to carry. Evelyn understood that. She understood it specifically. She left Osman to Harriet and went toward the elevator to check on Ashby before going up to see Calloway, and she was in the elevator when the phone rang again. Thorne, this time. She answered. What? Pryor's attorney made a statement to the FBI 20 minutes ago, Thorne said. They're calling it preliminary cooperation. A beat. He's offering information on the contractor network in exchange for consideration. Reyes says it's significant. Good. The name he gave for the central contractor contact. Thorne paused. It's someone with existing connections to 3 other hospitals in Colorado. 1 in Denver, 1 in Pueblo, 1 in Grand Junction. She watched the elevator numbers change. How many nurses? He was quiet for a second. How many nurses were terminated from those 3 hospitals for safety complaints, she said. A longer pause. We don't have that number yet. Someone should get it, she said. The elevator opened on 7. She stepped out into the corridor and moved toward Ashby's room, and through the window of 714 she could see him sitting up, more alert than he'd been that afternoon. The IV running steady, the monitor beside him showing numbers that were moving in the right direction. She knocked and opened the door. He looked at her immediately. You're still here, he said. For a while yet, she said. She sat down in the chair by his bed and pulled up his latest labs on the room tablet, and the numbers were doing what she'd expected. The cortisol replacement was working. The sodium was beginning to correct. The picture assembling itself into something that had a name and a treatment and a reasonable prognosis. The doctor told me I probably would have been discharged tomorrow, Ashby said, with the anxiety diagnosis. Yes. And then what? She didn't answer that directly, because the answer, that he would have gone home and gotten worse and eventually come back in a much more acute state, because primary adrenal insufficiency without treatment had a specific trajectory that was not kind, was a true answer she didn't think served him right now. You're not being discharged tomorrow, she said. He was quiet. Then, I heard some things in the hallway tonight, people talking. Something happened here? Something happened, she said. Are you okay? She looked at the labs, at the sodium trend, moving up slowly in exactly the right increments. I'm working on it, she said. He accepted that. People who'd been sick for long enough sometimes had a good instinct for which answers were the real ones. She stayed until his eyes started to close, the medication and the late hour combining into something that was finally, for the first time in 4 days, actually rest. And then she closed the chart and stood, and turned off the harsh overhead, leaving only the softer light by the monitor. In the corridor, she looked at her phone. 3 missed calls from a number she didn't know. A text from Thorne. Calloway's settled. Asking for you again, or recovery, 4th floor. She was at the elevator when the doors opened on their own and a person stepped out. Dr. Miriam Owens, internal medicine. The attending she'd messaged about Ashby. She was still in her coat, clearly coming from somewhere rather than going somewhere, and she stopped when she saw Evelyn. "You're Hayes," she said. "Yes." "I got your message about Ashby." Owens was studying her with the particular attention of a physician evaluating something. "I also got a message from the FBI about 4 hours ago asking me to preserve any documentation relating to patient complaints I'd received that were flagged from nursing staff in the past 18 months. Evelyn waited. "I have 7, Owens said. 7 complaint notes I received from nursing staff that I passed up to Dr. Holt's office per protocol. I never heard back about any of them." She paused. "I assumed they were handled." "Did you ever follow up to confirm?" Owen's expression shifted. Not defensively, more like someone taking a look at something they'd been choosing not to look at. "No," she said. "I didn't." "The FBI's interest in those notes. I understand the FBI's interest." Owens was quiet for a moment. "I just wanted to find you and tell you that tomorrow, when they take my statement, I'm going to tell them exactly what I told you, that I received the notes, forwarded them per protocol, and never confirmed they were acted on." A pause. "Because that's true, and it should be in the record." Evelyn looked at her. "That's going to be uncomfortable." "I imagine it will be." Owens looked at the wall, then back. "I also imagine I should have been more uncomfortable a long time ago." She went into Ashby's room to check on her patient. Evelyn stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and in the brief, suspended quiet of the moving elevator, alone for the first time in several hours, she let herself be exactly as tired as she actually was. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. The tremor in the right index finger only showed up in very specific conditions, and this wasn't one of them. But the rest of her was held together by the specific tension of someone who'd been running on something thinner than adrenaline for the last 3 hours. The elevator opened on 4. She found the recovery bay. A nurse outside checked her name against something on a tablet. Thorne had apparently arranged it, and nodded her through. Calloway was awake, barely. Post-surgical consciousness had its own particular quality. Present, but soft at the edges, pain managed to a level that was acceptable rather than absent, the body reasserting its reality after hours of controlled unconsciousness. He had equipment on him that she cataloged automatically and then consciously set aside, because she wasn't here as a medic. He looked at her when she came in. "Hayes," he said. His voice was rough. "Calloway," she said. A silence that wasn't uncomfortable. "I told them to find you," he said. "I know." "You were at this hospital." Not a question. "I worked here." He processed that. "Good timing." "Could have been better," she said. "They fired me about an hour before your helicopter arrived." Something moved in his face. "Seriously?" "They had a meeting and everything." He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. "You look, don't say terrible." "I was going to say like you've been working since 6 a.m. "That's about right." Another silence. Longer, but the same quality. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down, because standing felt performative and she was past performing anything. "Whitmore's in the record now," she said. "Voss declassified it." Calloway's jaw moved. He was quiet for a long moment. "I've been trying to get that done for 2 years, he said. "I know." She paused. "I didn't want it done. I just wanted to move on." "And now?" She thought about the conference room this afternoon, about Holt's folder, about 6 people with NDA agreements and 17 patient safety complaint copies hidden on a hard drive somewhere, about Sandra Okafor saying I needed to hear that it's real first. "Now I think moving on and letting something be in the record aren't mutually exclusive," she said. He considered that. "Took you a while." "Yeah." "Took me a while too," he said. To understand that you don't actually have to be in the uniform for it to still be true. She looked at the monitor beside him. His rhythm was solid, the numbers holding, the careful green lines of a body reasserting its right to continue. "Get some sleep," she said. He was already closing his eyes. She stayed for a few minutes, not because he needed her to, but because the room was quiet in a way that the rest of the building hadn't been all day, and she needed the quiet. The monitor cycled through its readings. The building's ventilation made its low, continuous sound. Her phone buzzed. Thorne. A text, not a call. "Need you downstairs. Now." Pryor's attorney just provided a name from the contractor network. FBI cross-referenced it with the hospital procurement records. She stood. "The name is on the staff roster here. Current employee. Has been here for 3 years." She was already moving toward the door. "Reyes says the person may have been feeding information on Calloway's transport route. The ambush wasn't random. Someone inside the hospital told them he was coming." She stopped in the doorway. Thorne's next text arrived while she was standing there, and she read it twice to make sure she'd read it correctly the first time. The name on the roster is Davis. ER nurse. He's been on shift all night. Davis, who she'd sent to Base 7 to help with Pruitt's code. Davis, who'd been at the nurse station when she'd arrived on the floor. Davis, who she'd trusted with a simple redirection and who had had, all evening, an unobstructed view of every military personnel movement through the ER. Her hand was on the doorframe. Davis, who she'd last seen 40 minutes ago walking toward the medication room with a tablet in his hand, alone, in a corridor that connected directly to the ambulance bay exit. She was moving before she finished reading the text. The fourth-floor corridor to the elevator felt longer than it was. Her mind was running the timeline. Davis at the nurse station when she'd arrived in the ER. Davis, whom she'd redirected to Bay 7. Davis, who'd been at the station when Thorne's people took down the fourth attacker in Bay 4. Right there. Present for all of it. And she hadn't thought twice about him because he was familiar, because he'd been there for 3 years, because familiarity was its own kind of blindness. She hit the elevator button, waited 2 seconds, took the stairs instead. Thorne was at the bottom of the stairwell on the ground floor when she came through, which meant he'd been moving too. Agent Reyes was with him, and a third person, a federal agent she hadn't seen before, younger, with a specific alert stillness of someone on an active intercept. "Medication corridor," Evelyn said. "He was heading there 40 minutes ago. There's an exit through the supply dock at the far end. It bypasses the ambulance bay entirely. Loading dock, north side, street access." Reyes looked at the younger agent. He was already on his radio. "Does he know we have his name?" Evelyn asked. "Pryor's attorney gave it at 10:40, Reyes said. "We don't know if anyone warned Davis, if Pryor made any other calls before we secured his phone." "He had the attorney," Thorne said. "The call log from before the attorney arrived showed 3 outgoing calls we're still identifying." 3 calls. 40 minutes ago. Davis might have gotten one of them, in which case he'd had 40 minutes to decide whether to run, and the medication corridor exit was the kind of route someone chose if they knew the building and didn't want to pass through any of the secured entry points. The younger agent said into his radio, "Loading dock, north side, 2 units to the exterior now." He listened, nodded. 1 unit already posted there from the perimeter hold. "They're moving to intercept." Evelyn looked at Thorne. "I know the interior route. Hayes, he's not armed as far as we know. He's a nurse who's been feeding information. If he's still inside, he's going to try to look like he belongs." She held Thorne's gaze. "I've worked with him for 2 years. If he sees a federal agent, he runs. If he sees me, he might run anyway," Reyes said. "He might. But I know what his running looks like and what his working looks like. There's a difference." She paused. "And I know the corridor." Reyes looked at Thorne. Something passed between them. The specific, compressed negotiation of 2 people deciding how much to trust a third. "Stay on comms," Reyes said. She handed Evelyn a radio earpiece, the clip-on kind. "You see him? You tell us. You do not approach alone." "Understood." She moved into the medication corridor. The hospital had a particular quality at this hour. 10:50 p.m., the deep night hum of a facility that never actually stopped but ran at a lower register after midnight approached. The medication corridor was lit by the fluorescent overhead that had a slight delay when you first entered, 3 seconds of flicker before it steadied, and she'd walked it so many times that her body navigated it without the light having to do anything. She slowed as she moved. The corridor ran straight for 40 feet, then bent right toward the supply staging area. There were 4 doors on the left side: medication room, clean supply, soiled utility, and the supervisor's station that was unmanned this late. All 4 were closed. The right side was blank wall until the bend. She listened. Footsteps. Not ahead of her. Behind one of the doors. The medication room, the second door. She stopped. The radio in her ear. She kept her voice barely above a breath. Medication room, second door on the left. He's inside. A pause. Then Reyes. Hold your position. 40 seconds. 40 seconds was a long time when someone who might be deciding whether to run was 12 feet away. She heard movement behind the door. The specific sound of the medication cabinet, the electronic beep of an access code being entered. He was doing something that looked like work, pulling a medication, making a log entry, building a record of innocent activity that said, "I was here for a reason," in case someone checked later, in case he needed the trail. The door opened. Davis came out with a medication tray in his hands, and he saw her, and for one fraction of a second his face did something that confirmed everything before it rearranged itself into something neutral. He was good. The rearrangement happened fast. "Hayes," he said, carefully surprised. "Didn't know you were still in the building." "Long night," she said. He was watching her. She was watching him. The medication tray was in his hands, and it was a real tray with real medications on it, which meant either he'd pulled them as actual cover or he'd been doing his job while also doing the other thing, and the two weren't mutually exclusive. "Yeah," he said. "Heard some things happened." A few things. He started to move past her toward the main corridor, casual, reasonable pace for someone carrying a medication tray. She stepped, not blocking him, just shifting her weight, a small repositioning that shortened the space between them without being a physical obstruction. He stopped, and the neutral expression cracked, not dramatically, just at the edges, a fraction. His eyes went to the earpiece. "Don't," she said. Quiet. Not a command, more like something she meant. He looked at her for a long moment. The tray was still in his hands. "I have patients on that tray," he said. "I know you might," she said. "And if you do, they're going to get their medications, just not in the next 2 minutes." Behind her, she heard the corridor door at the far end open, the sound of more than one person entering without hurrying. Davis looked past her, looked back at her. Something in his face that wasn't quite resignation and wasn't quite anything else she had a clean word for. He set the tray down on the supply cart beside the door, carefully, like he was still performing orderly, like the performance was the last thing he had. "How long?" she asked. She didn't entirely know why she asked. Maybe because she'd worked beside him for 2 years, and the human part of her needed some version of understanding, even if the understanding didn't change anything. He was quiet for a moment. "Long enough," he said. Reyes was behind her now. Davis didn't resist. He stood with his hands visible and his face doing something complicated that she stopped trying to read, because reading it wasn't going to give her anything useful, and she'd been reading people all day, and she was, in some layer beneath the part that was still running, exhausted by it. Reyes handled the rest. Evelyn picked up the medication tray and carried it to the nurse station herself. Checked the labels, checked the patients they were assigned to, delivered them, room by room, with the same hands and the same attention she'd brought to every other clinical task tonight, because the patients in those rooms had nothing to do with any of it, and they needed their medications, and that was still true, regardless of everything else. She was finishing the last delivery when her legs told her very clearly that they were done. She sat down in the chair at the nurse station and stayed there for a while. Look, the days that followed were not clean. Real aftermath never was. It had a texture that fiction didn't usually account for. The repetitive bureaucratic labor of federal investigations, the witness statements that had to be given in specific language, and then reviewed and clarified and given again. The calls from attorneys, the calls from journalists that she didn't take, The strange, suspended quality of her days, which had no shift to report to and no chart to update, and too much time to think. Davis was charged with federal conspiracy, obstruction, and material support of the contractor network. His cooperation was partial and strategic, and his attorney was better than Pryor's, but the evidence was comprehensive enough that cooperation was less a choice than a calculation about degrees of outcome. The 3 years of payment records from an offshore account tied to the primary contractor shell company told a story that didn't require much interpretation. Pryor was charged on 11 counts. His preliminary cooperation bought him a reduced framework, but not immunity, which was the correct outcome for a man who'd spent 30 months siphoning money from Medicare, silencing the people who noticed, and providing logistics intelligence to a network that had sent armed men into a civilian hospital. The calculation that he'd made, that small institutional corruption was manageable, that the connection to the contractor was a profitable but containable risk, had underestimated, fatally, how much the people he'd been suppressing had quietly documented. Sandra Okafor's 17 complaint copies turned out to be the most comprehensive single body of evidence in the case. She'd kept them in a folder on an external drive in a closet for 8 months because she'd had the instinct that someday it would matter, and the instinct had been right. She testified before a federal grand jury 6 weeks after the night at Redstone, and she did it without an NDA violation because the FBI had a mechanism for that, and because the attorney who'd told her not to keep copies had, it turned out, been paid through a referral arrangement with Pryor's firm. That particular thread led to 3 additional charges and a separate state bar inquiry. Holt lost his medical license on an expedited review process that his attorney fought and lost at every stage. The board's findings were specific and documented and covered 8 instances of retaliatory action against clinical staff who had flagged his errors or his decisions. 2 of those instances involved patients who had subsequently experienced adverse outcomes that the incident reports had been structured to misattribute. The board used the word egregious in the summary, which was not a word that board typically used and which meant something in proportion to how rarely they said it. He did not go to prison. Evelyn spent some time being angry about that and then put it somewhere she could live with because the license was gone and the public record was permanent, and sometimes that had to be enough. Not because it was satisfying, because she didn't have the bandwidth to carry what it felt like when it wasn't. Dr. Kira Osman stayed. That was the part that mattered more than Evelyn expected it to. The second-year resident who'd been taught to doubt herself by the specific institutional culture that Holt had built, who'd gone back to a chart because a fired nurse had said something true on her way out the door. She stayed, and she applied for a trauma rotation extension. And 6 weeks after the night of the code, she sent Evelyn a message that said simply, "I looked harder this time. Caught something. Patient's okay." Evelyn read it 3 times and then put her phone down and sat with the particular feeling of something mattering in a way that was disproportionate to its size. Robert Ashby was diagnosed with primary adrenal insufficiency secondary to autoimmune adrenalitis. He was discharged with a management plan, a medical alert bracelet, and the phone number of an endocrinologist in Denver who specialized in the condition. He sent a card to the hospital, to the nursing floor, addressed generally, because he didn't know exactly how to direct it, that said he was doing better and that someone had told him the truth when he needed it. The card ended up on the bulletin board in the 3rd floor break room. Evelyn saw it there 6 weeks later, on a day she was in the building for a different reason, and stood reading it for a moment in the particular way you read something that is evidence of an outcome you weren't there to see. The formal ceremony was Voss's idea, though he framed it as a request and left the choice to her, which was the kind of thing he did. Ashcroft's city council had already been in contact about a civilian commendation, apparently a federal investigation being cracked open in your mid-sized Colorado city generated a degree of civic attention, and the hospital board, now entirely reconstituted after the removal of every member with direct ties to Pryor's administration, had proposed something of their own. She'd said yes to both because it felt wrong to refuse and because Thorne had told her, in the plainest possible terms, that sometimes you let people do the thing they need to do to feel like the story ended correctly. And that wasn't weakness, it was just understanding how human beings process things. The ceremony was on a Thursday in December, in the hospital's main lobby, which had been arranged for it. Chairs, a small podium, people from the city and from the reconstituted board and from the federal side and from the hospital staff, all in the same room with the slightly awkward energy of groups who didn't usually share space trying to collectively mark something. Calloway was there. He was 3 months out of surgery, moving more carefully than he'd like, with a cane he used inconsistently depending on how much the leg was bothering him and how much he felt like admitting it was bothering him. He'd driven up from Denver with 2 members of his unit, and he stood near the back because he said the chairs made his hip lock up, which was true, and was also the kind of excuse a person used when they didn't want to be at the center of attention at an event that was technically happening partly because of them. Thorne was there in dress uniform. He'd shaken her hand in the parking lot before the ceremony and said, "You made my job harder 3 separate times tonight." And she'd said, "Your job was to secure the building." And he'd said, "Fair." And that had been most of what needed to be said between them. General Voss gave remarks. He was not a man who gave long speeches, which she appreciated. He spoke about what had happened at FOB Whitmore in terms she'd authorized him to use, specific enough to be real, restrained enough to respect what that event actually was. He spoke about the night at Redstone with the directness of someone describing a sequence of events rather than constructing a narrative around them, which was the right way to do it. And then he said something she hadn't known he was going to say. "The definition of a warrior is not someone who carries a weapon," he said. "It's someone who doesn't stop when stopping would be easier." Staff Sergeant Hayes, Nurse Hayes, has never stopped. Not in a drainage ditch in a place we can't name publicly. Not in a parking lot. Not in an emergency room when every institutional structure around her was telling her she didn't belong there. He looked at her directly. She belonged there. She always did. We just took too long to say so out loud. The room applauded. She stood at the podium afterward and said 3 sentences, because 3 sentences was all she'd prepared, and she didn't believe in saying more than you had. And the 3 sentences were, she was glad Calloway was alive. She was glad the patients who'd been failed by this institution had their records in a federal file where they could matter. And she believed that the people who'd kept quiet and kept copies and stayed uncomfortable because something was wrong, they were the ones who'd actually cracked this open. She was just the person who'd been in the parking lot at the right time. She stepped back from the podium before anyone could add to it. So, the hospital board offered her the position 3 weeks later. Not her old job. Something they'd designed after a set of conversations she'd been partially involved in. Director of Clinical Safety and Military Trauma Training. A new department that didn't exist before. Funded partly through a settlement arrangement from the contractor case and partly through a state grant that someone at the federal level had quietly facilitated. The mandate was to build a trauma training program for clinical staff with a specific focus on military patient care and to serve as the hospital's patient safety oversight lead, which was a role that was going to require her to have authority she'd never had before and was going to make her unpopular with some people in some rooms on some days. She said yes after 4 days of thinking about it, which was 3 days longer than she'd actually needed. She said yes because the patients in those rooms were still going to need someone who didn't leave it alone. Because Kira Osman was going to keep catching things and needed an institutional structure that didn't punish her for it. Because Sandra Okafor had said she'd be willing to come back if the environment was actually different, and Evelyn thought she could help make it different. And she didn't think that was arrogance so much as specificity about what she was actually good at. She also said yes because the work was what had kept her going for the past 2 years, even when everything around the work was broken, and the answer to broken structures wasn't to leave. It was to become the person who fixed them, which was uncomfortable and imperfect, and wasn't going to be the version of herself she'd imagined when she'd left the army wanting something quieter. She wasn't, it turned out, a quieter kind of person. She'd just been in the wrong rooms. Her first week in the new position, she sat with the reconstituted Patient Safety Committee for 3 hours going through a backlog of complaint reports that had been filed and then filed away. Not shredded, not destroyed, just buried in a folder structure that required someone with both access and motivation to dig through. She found 41 complaints over 30 months, 41 instances of clinical staff flagging something that someone above them had decided was less important than institutional comfort. 37 of those complaints had been correct. She made a list of every patient who'd been affected. She contacted the hospital's legal and patient relations teams and told them she needed outreach protocols for every one of those cases, Because those patients and families deserved to know what had happened, and the institution owed them that, regardless of how uncomfortable the conversations would be. The new board chair said, carefully, that the legal exposure on that kind of proactive disclosure was significant. She said, "I know, do it anyway." He said he'd take it to council. She said, "Do that too. And tell council that we're disclosing and the question is how, not whether." He took it to council. Council, reviewing the existing federal investigation record and the institutional liability calculus with all the prior era information, now part of the public record, agreed that proactive disclosure was both ethically required and, in this particular context, the only approach that had any chance of rebuilding anything worth rebuilding. They started the outreach in January. It was hard. Some of the conversations were the hardest things she'd been in a room for, and she'd been in rooms where people were dying. Because this was a different kind of harm, the slow institutional kind, the kind that happened when the people whose job was to care had been systematically taught to stay quiet, and the people who hadn't stayed quiet had been removed. The harm of being told that your instincts were wrong, that your concerns were friction, that the machine mattered more than what the machine was for. She sat in those conversations, and she didn't have clean answers, and she didn't pretend to. What she had was a record that was now in the open and a commitment that was on paper, and a department whose entire purpose was to make sure the machine remembered what it was for. It wasn't restoration. You couldn't restore what those patients had lost, what those nurses had carried, what the families had gone through, not understanding why their person hadn't been caught earlier. You could only account for it honestly and do the next thing differently. That was the work. That was all the work ever was. On the last Friday in January, 4 months after the night everything changed, she walked into the ER at 6 a.m. for the first time in a different capacity. Same floor, same fluorescent lights, with the particular quality she'd memorized over 2 years. Same smell of antiseptic and coffee, and the specific institutional air of a building that had been running all night and hadn't stopped. Paula was at the end of a night shift, charting, and she looked up when Evelyn came through the doors and said, "You're early." "I'm always early," Evelyn said. "Different early now." "A little," Evelyn said. Paula looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who wanted to say something and was deciding how to say it. "It's better," she said finally. "It's actually better in here. I want you to know that." Evelyn looked at the bay assignments. 3 occupied, 2 pending. A night shift handing off to a day shift with the accumulated care of a building that had been doing its job for 8 hours in the dark. "Good," she said. She didn't say it was because of her. It wasn't, mostly. It was because of 37 complaints that now had files. Because of Kira Osman catching things and not being punished for it. Because of Sandra Okafor, who had come back in December and who was in the building right now, on nights, doing exactly the job she'd been doing before someone decided her instincts were a liability. It was because of every person who'd stayed uncomfortable when comfort would have been easier, and who'd kept the copies, and who'd filed the report even when they knew it would go into a folder and maybe never come out. She was not the story. She was just the person who'd been in the parking lot,